While many are quick to point out the idea that returning to older seasons within Fortnite highlights some kind of lazy fix for boosting player counts for the game, I personally don't see much of an issue with reusing older content to reinvigorate players' interest in the game. Season OG's model of rebooting multiple seasons from an old chapter to be condensed into the time frame of a month at the end of the year really has no inherent flaws. It appeals quite heavily to the target demographic's attention span and allows them to promote future chapters to returning players. So if Season OG is a low-effort, content-packed, well-paced season, why bother questioning whether or not it should end? Well, surprisingly, this 1 month leads to many other indirect problems with the state of Battle Royale that have affected most of this chapter. While Season OG is great in isolation, I fear that it has impacted the way Epic chooses to approach their content with their current seasons. It's unfortunate because Season OG really hasn't served as the wake-up call that I had initially hoped it would be. Despite its success, Epic continues to push away from grounded gunplay within their Battle Royale. It seems like Epic isn't interested in targeting those older players with their BR anymore, and while I take much issue with this, to some extent I can't blame them. Many old players naturally get excited for the idea of Fortnite's grounded gunplay. However, featuring chapters that heavily rely on that aspect diminishes the impact of Season OG. While I initially believed Season OG to be an experiment that Epic could learn from, it seems they have come to a completely different conclusion compared to what I had hoped.
What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money!
From Epic's perspective, it ultimately just doesn't make that much sense to return to more basic gunplay when much of the current audience no longer views it as a necessity. Yes, their reboot of Chapter 1 was very successful, but Epic views it more as a cow that they can milk through repetition, rather than using the aspects that many enjoyed to apply to future seasons. I don't necessarily have an issue with returning to older seasons. However, it would be nice to see some of the content that elevated those seasons be applied into future ones. Instead, they have started a trend of pushing out older seasons each year in an effort to follow a model that is ultimately less risky for their Battle Royale. But what exactly do I mean by less risky? Something I've noticed specifically with Chapter 5 is this hyperfixation on creating more content if it means that that content is ultimately less impactful long-term for the game. The risk behind spending more time on a weapon or feature is the potential that that new weapon or feature falls flat.
You're a fucking disappointment.
If Epic spends less time worrying about the quality of each edition and its impact on the game, they can create a potentially higher quantity of changes. They've created a model that targets the low attention span of the current player base, and they no longer have a barrier of quality that they have to overcome. The content within BR doesn't really seem to be created for meaningful innovation, but rather attempting something entirely new within the game simply because it hasn't been done before. This results in a mass of different items, vehicles, features, and sometimes even mechanics that don't survive past their season or chapter because Epic never asked themselves what positive aspects this content creates for the game. While many will contest that Fortnite is constantly evolving in an effort to sell the idea that the game is in a healthy state, it seems like many don't actually understand what quantifies evolution. It's difficult to argue that changes that are removed within the span of mere months really have any lasting impact on the game. While evolution is fundamentally about change and adaptation, it also has an underlying sense of consistency. Yes, more recent Fortnite seasons showcase just as much, if not more, change and adaptation than the game's early chapters, but they lack a vital part of evolution, and that's consistency. Clearly, if the addition of vehicle mods were an evolutionary change for Fortnite, they would remain a consistent feature in future seasons. I'm not arguing that every single change within the game has to be evolutionary, but I see this buzzword that has essentially lost all meaning due to its utilization as a gotcha moment thrown around whenever the defender feels cornered, despite its lack of application to really any changes that have been introduced with Chapter 5. And by now, for those of you who haven't left your death threats in the comments below, the usual dismissal of everything I've presented for my case
You are done!
is the idea that I'm pushing for the game to be permanently stuck in Chapter 1 as some kind of static experience, as if that's what consistency means. So if my perspective doesn't entail a permanent Season OG, what exactly do I mean when I say consistency? To me, consistency within a video game is upholding a certain identity. Maintaining this identity doesn't mean you aren't allowed to innovate or introduce change, but there should be an underlying sense of consistency with the experience you have created. I think a great example of this is Donkey Kong Country Returns and its sequel, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Despite being two entirely different games, the sequel remains incredibly faithful to the original in level design, mechanics, aesthetic, and overall gameplay. You can play one level from Donkey Kong Country Returns and another from Tropical Freeze, and despite being completely completely unique in their own ways, it feels as if it's a continuation of the original because the developers quite literally designed it to exist within that world. And this doesn't present a monotonous gameplay pattern. Tropical Freeze added 2 completely new characters that add interesting and dynamic ways of traversing and completing a level. The game also improves heavily on boss fights when compared to the original, in a way that I would argue makes them more engaging and difficult. The gap between these games' release is a significant 6 years, but despite that, Nintendo was able to maintain the same level design, mechanics, and even aesthetic, with most of these being a vast improvement to the original. This underlying sense of consistency isn't something that's exclusive to these 2 games, and is even present in older Fortnite chapters. The comparison between Chapter 2 and 3 showcases a very similar pattern. Chapter 3 is meant to be a sequel to Chapter 2, and you can imagine many of its locations existing on the Chapter 2 map due to the similar logic that was followed for their map design. This doesn't mean that all the POIs are exactly the same, but rather Chapter 3's map is a continuation of what worked with much improvement. While I have many issues with the loot pools throughout Chapter 3, Reload proves that many of the weapons that were balanced can coexist with the Chapter 2 loot pool. Going somewhat back to the original topic of Season OG, the interesting thing about it is that it's by far one of the least faithful recreations of the Chapter 1 map.
You think this is funny?
In a cosmic sort of way, yes.
Well, Mr. Funny Man, is this how you get your sick kicks?
What? It's just an ordinary crabby. Oh my goodness!
We have had old playable builds like Project Era, and even maps created using the Unreal editor for Fortnite that have all been in most ways more accurate than the season that Epic gave us during Chapter 1 OG. However, despite the lack of faithfulness in certain areas, Season OG felt as if it was an extension of Chapter 1 due to the gameplay remaining consistent with Chapter 1. I want future chapters and seasons to innovate and add new features, but I also want them to follow a consistent pattern that is defined by the game's identity. To go back to the main question of whether or not Season OG should end, the conclusion that I have come to is that it likely should. I don't feel this way because I'm against the model of Season OG, rather because I would have preferred Season OG to be a one-time experiment that gave Epic important information on how to benefit the future of the game. But it seems Epic is more interested on milking it for everything it's worth, instead of adapting what made it enjoyable. They understand that revisiting Chapter 1 again isn't going to have the same impact as it did in 2023, so they have set their sights on the next best thing, Chapter 2. On a side note, many people have discussed the potential issues surrounding the selection of seasons, and while I agree with the criticism, I think it can still work if they go for a hybrid approach like they did with Chapter 1. This means just leave out the content that didn't work and adjust the loot pool accordingly to what makes the most sense. For example, during Season 3, if they decide to re-add the charged shotgun, maybe don't remove the pump this time, or for the map, it might make more sense to leave the grotto during Season 3, considering that it's a far healthier decision than turning it into a swimming pool. Regardless of how I think the future of Season OG should look, I have no doubt that Chapter 2 will be phenomenal. Let me know what your perspective on Season OG is in the comments below, and consider subscribing if you made it this far. Anyways, thank you for watching and have a great day.